Before I start, I want to mention that I try to keep my videos family friendly, for the most part. This video isn't going to be like that, so be forewarned. While everything I talk about is purely for educational and informative purposes, some of the graphics and footage shown of certain games can be mature, and will include blood, gore, sexual themes, and torture. If you could potentially be grossed out or offended by this, turn away now. It's no secret that Mortal Kombat brought about the invention of the ESRB rating. This game was gory, violent, and changed the face of gaming forever. But I don't want to talk about the obvious ones. Video game controversies are fun, and though Mortal Kombat certainly holds the title for the most infamous controversy, it's far from being the only one. So let's take a look at some conflicts that took place in this industry before Mortal Kombat's release. The first one I want to talk about goes way back. We're talking over 40 years ago, in 1973, a time when there was really only one relevant video game company in the eyes of many, Atari. You're probably asking, how could there possibly be controversy if games like Pong were the only thing available? Well, feast your eyes on this. Disgusting, isn't it? This is just wrong on so many levels. In all seriousness, the problem with this game, called Gotcha, wasn't its gameplay. It was the machine you play it on. People saw the controller a bit breast-like. Two pink squish pads, as I like to call them, were used to control this game. It was a two-player game where two symbols, a plus sign and a square, got involved in an epic game of tag. It was meant to be a guy chasing down a girl, but in 1973 it was hard to emulate that in a video game, so this is what you're left with. The advertisements and arcade art were enough to show what the game was attempting to be, and if that left any doubt in the player's mind, the controller should have gotten rid of that. You essentially squeeze the controller in order to move your character. To put it blunt, it's like squishing breasts. So if you're at all curious how in the world a game from the early 1970s could lead to any amount of controversy, breast controllers. Not a bad way to start the video. And it didn't take too long after for the first in-game controversy to sprout up. In 1976, a game known as Death Race was released. Exidy developed this game, and based off of their earlier release, Destruction Derby. While both games were fairly violent, Death Race takes the cake as being the more extreme of the two. Destruction Derby simply involved you trying to run into other people's cars, but in Death Race, your only goal is to run people over. And in two-player mode, it's a race to see who can kill the most people with their vehicle. It's pretty gruesome for a 1976 game, with screaming every time you run somebody over. And since games were just pixels and black and white blocks at the time, it's hard to really tell exactly what's going on in these games, but Death Race gets its message out there pretty clearly. Ironically, this is one of the first examples of negative press is still good press. Exidy didn't plan on pushing this game much at all, as it was meant to be a holdover for one of their later releases, Car Polo. However, after an article was written by Wendy Walker saying how dangerous this game was, sales for Exidy soared, and they attributed this to all the articles and papers being written about the game. And this wasn't Exidy's only rumble with controversial games in the press. About 10 years later, in 1986, they released Chiller, and this is an interesting one. Chiller is a game about mutilating and torturing victims in a dungeon setting. The better you torture, the more points you get. It's fairly disturbing. There isn't a story for this game at all, and instead you just try to torture as best as you can. There are sections with monsters and ghosts, but each of those is preceded and followed by a level where you torture normal looking humans in a dungeon. And this is bloody. The arcade version is just nasty. Whether it's a guillotine, gunshot, those stretch machines, this game has it all. But the story of this game goes far beyond that. Every game we've talked about so far has been released in the arcades, and this game is no different. But this game also had an NES release. This game, on a Nintendo console. It doesn't sound right at all, but this game went through significant censorship before making its way to the NES. In fact, its NES release wasn't until 4 years later, in 1990. The NES release censored much of the blood, and also attempted to add a story that explained why you were torturing and shooting everyone and everything in sight. The story was that monsters were coming back from the dead, and you had to kill them all before they created a large army. Censorship can only take you so far though, and even though the two games looked vastly different from each other, the NES version is still pretty grotesque. But regardless of your opinion on this, Chiller might be one of the most advanced NES games out there. There's a large variety of targets to shoot at, and it seems to offer more than most NES games did at the time. So one thing is for sure, Exidy did put some solid effort into this game. So Chiller's clearly a step up in the gory department, but that's because of how graphically advanced it was compared to its 1976 counterpart. And if it makes you feel better, this game didn't sell well at all. While Death Race seemed to have profited off of the negative press, this game suffered, being rejected from most arcades and being extremely hard to find anywhere. And the NES censorship likely turned some people away from it. This company only made a few more games before they were acquired by another company. But let's go backward again for a second, and talk about a company known as Mystique. The first sentence on their Wikipedia page pretty much says it all. Let me share it with you. Mystique was a company that produced a number of pornographic video games for the Atari 2600. Yeah, they made porn games for an Atari console. One game was called Beat 'em and Eat 'em, a game about catching sperm in your mouth. There's also Bachelor Party, which is the game Breakout, but with naked men and women. Basically, they're all very sexual in nature, but none stand with Custer's Revenge, a game about dodging projectiles from the sky and banging a Native American chick. This game pretty much set off about every alarm, being called racist, sexist, and promoting rape. The game designer stated that the sex was consensual, but even if that was the case, why? This game has no premise or anything. Funny enough, the company made these games because they believed adults didn't care about the other stuff being put out there. Adults like sex, and they wanted to make games with that theme in mind. But this isn't a game. You walk to the right, watch some awkward pixely sex, and then get right back to it again. The girl is also tied to a pole, which certainly doesn't help their "it's not rape" arguments. There's a game known as General Retreat out there, where Custer is the one tied to the pole. Okay, whatever. And now we're all caught up. Almost. Mortal Kombat was released in August of 1992, and while it received most of the credit for kicking the ESRB system off, it wasn't the only controversial game released that year. Wolfenstein 3D. If you think this looks like Doom, you'd be accurate, seeing as both games were made by id Software. This game is a violent, gory shooter, with tons of blood and action. The thing is, this wasn't what most people had a problem with. The game series is all about fighting against Nazis, and this game featured a ton of Nazi symbolism. In fact, the final boss of this game is Hitler himself. Interestingly enough, this game isn't all that more violent than some of the other games released before, but with graphics getting steadily better and character models starting to resemble actual humans, it's no surprise people were beginning to take a stand to protect their children from these games. Mortal Kombat and Night Trap both followed later that year, and these games made some sort of satanic trilogy that people could not stand for. Still, controversial games have been coming out in droves, and even as recently as 2018, games like Agony still are making waves with some of their content. As long as video games and media are out there will always be something controversial to talk about. Thanks everybody for watching, I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what topics you'd like to see covered in the future, and if you liked, don't forget to subscribe. Bye-bye.